Welcome to Grey Vale Echoes. Dive into chilling gothic horror, where haunted castles, ghostly secrets, and eerie relics unravel terrifying truths. Join us for spine-tingling tales of the unknown. Tonight, we uncover a historical mystery from the sands of Egypt, a powerful amulet tied to a long-dead witch queen. For one man, discovering this artifact is not a triumph, but an invitation to a world of supernatural horror. Our story tonight is a deep dive into the intoxicating and often perilous world of obsessive genius. It is a tale that explores the thin, wavering line between scholarly passion and dangerous madness, and what happens when a brilliant mind, in its relentless search for knowledge, unearths a power that was meant to remain buried. The stage for our tragedy is not a crumbling Gothic castle, but a respectable London townhouse, a place of quiet streets and foggy nights. But within its brick walls, a darkness as ancient and profound as any medieval curse was about to be unleashed. At the heart of our story is Antony Ferrara, a man who was, by all accounts, a prodigy. He was one of the most brilliant Egyptologists of his generation, a man whose understanding of ancient languages and arcane rituals was unparalleled. While his colleagues focused on cataloging pottery and measuring pyramids, Ferrara was drawn to the shadows of Egyptian history. He was fascinated by the forgotten cults, the forbidden texts, the dark magic that the official histories preferred to ignore. He pursued the whispers of sorcery and the legends of supernatural power with a single-minded intensity that was both awe-inspiring and, to those who knew him well, deeply unsettling. He was a man chasing ghosts, and it seemed in recent months that he was finally on the verge of catching one. For the past several weeks, Ferrara had become a recluse. The once sociable scholar, famous for his lively dinner parties and passionate debates, had locked himself away in his study. He had dismissed his servants, refused all visitors, and had ceased communication with the outside world, save for the occasional, cryptic note delivered by a street urchin. His friends and colleagues were concerned, but their worry was rebuffed by the unyielding silence from within the house. They told themselves it was simply the eccentricity of genius, a period of intense focus on a new and groundbreaking project. But one man, his closest and oldest friend, knew it was something more. Our story is seen through the eyes of Robert Cairn, a man of a very different temperament. Cairn was a doctor, a man of science and logic, grounded in the tangible world of anatomy and empirical evidence. He was the anchor to Ferrara's soaring and often reckless intellectual kite. Their friendship was a classic case of opposites attracting. Cairn's steady pragmatism had always served as a balance to Ferrara's passionate flights of fancy. But now that balance was gone. Cairn had not seen or spoken to his friend in over a month, and a deep, gnawing unease had taken root in his heart. He knew Ferrara's passions better than anyone, and he knew how easily they could curdle into dangerous obsession. He feared that Ferrara had finally strayed too far from the path of academic study and had begun to walk a much darker road, a road that led from the study of magic to its actual practice. Driven by a concern that had now blossomed into genuine fear, Cairn arrived at Ferrara's townhouse on a damp, foggy evening. The house, usually a place of light and intellectual vibrancy, was dark and silent. It looked like a tomb. He knocked on the heavy oak door, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet street. He waited. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, his fist hammering against the wood. Still nothing. The silence from within was absolute. A dead, watchful silence that seemed to confirm his worst fears. He tried the handle. To his astonishment, it turned. The door, which he had expected to be bolted and barred, was unlocked. This small, simple fact sent a jolt of pure dread through him. Ferrara was meticulous, almost paranoid, about his security and privacy, especially when he was deep in a project. For the door to be unlocked was not a sign of welcome. It was a sign that something was terribly wrong. It was a violation of the established order, a crack in the fortress that suggested the man inside was no longer in control. He pushed the door open, his heart pounding. "Antony?" he called out, his voice sounding small and weak in the cavernous, silent hall. "Antony, are you here?" "It's Robert." There was no reply. The only sound was the soft click of the door closing behind him, a sound of finality that made him feel as if he had just stepped into a trap. The air in the hall was cold and stale, heavy with the smell of dust and neglect. It felt like a house that had been empty for years, not weeks. He made his way through the familiar ground floor rooms, the drawing room, the library, the dining hall. All were dark, their furniture draped in ghostly white dust cloths, silent testaments to a life that had been abruptly put on hold. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. His destination, the source of his dread, was on the second floor. Ferrara's study, the one room that had been his friend's entire world for the past month. As Cairn ascended the grand, sweeping staircase, he felt a palpable change in the atmosphere. The air grew warmer, and a strange, new scent began to snake its way down the stairs to meet him. It was a sweet, cloying, and deeply exotic smell, a perfume of strange spices and burning leaves that he couldn't quite identify, but which spoke of foreign lands and ancient rituals. He reached the landing. The door to the study, which for weeks had been a symbol of his friend's reclusive madness, was now directly in front of him, and it was slightly ajar. A thin, vertical sliver of flickering, reddish light pulsed from the opening, and the strange, sweet smoke was thick and heavy here, pouring from the room like a foul exhalation. He could hear something now, too. A faint, monotonous, rhythmic sound from within. A low, guttural chanting. This was the moment of truth. Every rational instinct in Cairn's body screamed at him to turn back, to flee this strangely altered house, to go and fetch the authorities. This was no longer a simple matter of a concerned friend checking on another. He had stumbled upon something that felt deeply, profoundly wrong. The door in front of him did not feel like the entrance to a scholar's study. It felt like the gateway to another world, a forbidden chamber where the rules of his own logical, scientific reality no longer applied. He felt a powerful, primal sense of dread, a feeling that if he were to cross that threshold, he would be stepping into a place from which he might not be able to return. But his concern for Antony, his loyalty to the man who had been his friend for 20 years, was stronger than his fear. What if Antony was inside, sick or hurt, or in the grip of some terrible drug-induced delirium? He could not abandon him. He had to know what lay beyond that door. He had to enter the forbidden chamber. He placed his hand on the door, the wood warm to the touch, and pushed it open. The initial shock was a physical blow to the senses. He was hit by a wall of heat and smoke so thick and so sudden that it made him stagger back, coughing, his eyes watering. The heat was not the dry, pleasant warmth of a fireplace. It was a damp, oppressive heat, like the air of a jungle or a furnace room. And the smoke was not the gray, acrid smoke of burning wood. It was a thick, white, and heavily perfumed smoke, carrying the sweet, spicy, and deeply unsettling scent he had smelled on the stairs. It filled his lungs, his head, making him feel dizzy and disoriented. When his eyes finally adjusted to the stinging haze, he could see the source of the heat and smoke. In the very center of the room, where Ferrara's grand mahogany desk should have been, there was now a large, ornate bronze brazier. And in this brazier, a fire burned, not with clean, bright flames, but with a sullen, reddish-orange glow, emitting clouds of the thick, white smoke. Strange, dried herbs and what looked like twisted pieces of dark resin were smoldering on the coals, the source of the room's unholy perfume. This was no longer Antony Ferrara's study. It had been transformed into a temple, a sorcerer's workshop. The familiar, comfortable room lined with books had become a stage for some dark and ancient ritual. Cairn stepped inside, his feet crunching on something gritty that covered the floor. He looked down and saw that it was sand, fine, yellow sand that had been spread evenly across the entire Persian rug, turning the floor of a London study into a small, contained desert. The changes were so profound, so complete, that for a moment he was utterly disoriented. He felt like he had been transported thousands of miles and thousands of years into the past. This room did not belong in the 19th century. It belonged in a hidden chamber beneath a pyramid, in the sanctum of a high priest of some forgotten, snake-worshipping cult. The presence of something ancient, something that was not just being studied but was being actively invoked, was a palpable, living force in the room. The initial shock of entry was beginning to curdle into a deep and terrifying understanding. Ferrara had not just been studying magic. He had been performing it, and the evidence of his dark work was all around him. Once Robert Cairn's eyes had adjusted to the stinging, acrid smoke, and his initial, coughing fit had subsided, he was able to truly take in the full, horrifying extent of his friend's transformation. The room was the desecration of everything it had once been. It was no longer a place of logic, learning, and quiet contemplation. It had become a shrine to a dark and ancient power, a place where the boundaries between the modern world and a far more primal, magical one had been deliberately and terrifyingly erased. The first and most overwhelming sensory input was the sight of the place, a visual feast of the grotesque and the sacred. The only light in the room came from the single, large bronze brazier that now dominated the center of the space. The fire within it was not a cheerful, dancing flame. It was a sullen, angry, reddish-orange heart that pulsed with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, consuming the strange herbs and resins that had been thrown upon it. This flickering, unsteady light was a master of distortion. It cast long, dancing, and truly monstrous shadows that writhed and coiled on the walls and ceiling. The familiar shapes of the furniture that remained a tall bookshelf, a high-backed chair were transformed into looming, hunched beasts, dark, silent observers to the unholy proceedings. The shadows themselves seemed to have a life of their own, a restless, malevolent energy that made the entire room feel as though it were breathing. And the walls were a testament to Ferrara's madness. The elegant, book-lined walls that Cairn knew so well were gone. The bookshelves had been pushed back against the far wall, a jumble of discarded knowledge from a world that no longer mattered to Ferrara. The walls themselves had been covered, from floor to ceiling, in what looked like enormous, hand-painted frescoes. They were rendered in the classic Egyptian style, with figures in profile, strange, animal-headed gods, and intricate, geometric borders. But the subject matter was not the usual fare of pharaohs and peaceful offerings. These were scenes of dark magic, of sorcerous rituals. Cairn, whose knowledge of Egyptology was considerable thanks to his long friendship with Ferrara, recognized some of the figures. There was Thoth, the ibis-headed god of wisdom and magic, but here he was depicted not as a benevolent scribe, but as a grim-faced sorcerer, his eyes glowing with a sinister light. He saw images of Anubis, not as a gentle guide to the underworld, but as a terrifying, fanged judge, weighing not a heart, but a screaming, writhing human soul. The frescoes were crudely done, painted with a frantic, obsessive energy, but their power was undeniable. They were not just decorations, they were invocations. And interspersed between the painted figures were ancient manuscripts, pages torn from priceless, centuries-old papyrus scrolls that had been tacked directly to the wall. The delicate, black ink of the hieroglyphic and demotic scripts was a stark, spidery web against the painted plaster. The entire room had been turned into a three-dimensional, immersive grimoire, a book of forbidden magic that you didn't read, but that you walked into. The flickering firelight made the painted figures seem to move, their painted eyes seeming to follow him as he stood, frozen, on the threshold. Just as his mind was beginning to process the visual chaos of the room, a new layer of sensory information asserted itself. The sound. He had heard it faintly from the hallway, but here, inside the chamber, it was a constant, pervasive presence. It was a low, monotonous, and deeply eerie chanting. It was a single male voice, deep and resonant, speaking or chanting in a language that Cairn had never heard before. It was not Arabic, not Coptic, not any of the modern languages of the region. It sounded older, more guttural, a language of sand and stone and forgotten gods. The sound was not coming from a person. It seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, as if the house had absorbed the sound and was now playing it back on an endless loop. Cairn scanned the room and saw the source. Tucked away in a dark corner was one of those new, miraculous inventions. A phonograph. A wax cylinder was turning slowly on its spindle, the needle tracing its groove, broadcasting this ancient, ghostly voice into the room. Ferrara, in his obsessive quest for authenticity, had apparently found a recording of a genuine ritual, or perhaps had even made one himself. But the mechanical source of the sound did little to rob it of its power. In fact, it almost made it worse. The juxtaposition of the modern, scientific marvel of the phonograph with the ancient, supernatural power of the words it was speaking was a perfect symbol of Ferrara's own fractured mind. The chanting was a hypnotic, droning sound that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate deep within Cairn's bones. It was a sound designed to alter consciousness, to lull the rational mind into a trance-like state, to open a doorway for things that were not of this world. Then there was the smell. It was the most physically oppressive element of the room. The air was thick, heavy, and almost unbreathable, saturated with the sweet, cloying scent of the burning incense. Cairn recognized the primary notes. There was the rich, complex aroma of kifi, the most sacred of the Egyptian temple incenses, a compound of 16 different ingredients, said to induce prophetic dreams. And there was the heady, narcotic scent of the blue lotus flower, a plant associated with creation, rebirth, and altered states of consciousness. But mixed in with these almost sacred aromas was something else, something that was deeply, fundamentally wrong. It was a faint, underlying scent that was metallic and coppery, like the smell of old blood. And there was another note, a musky, animalistic smell, like the scent of a predator's den. This combination of the sacred and the profane, the sweet and the foul, created an atmosphere that was both intoxicating and deeply nauseating. The thick, white smoke swirled around him, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his skin. He felt as if he were being embalmed, his own living body being permeated by the perfumes of the dead. He had to force himself to take shallow breaths, fighting against the instinct to gag. The smell was a physical assault, a chemical weapon designed to break down the barriers of the conscious mind. And finally, there was the feeling, the intangible but most powerful sensation of all. The room was not just hot. It was alive with a strange, palpable energy. It was a feeling of intense, static electricity the kind of charged atmosphere you feel just before a lightning strike. The air itself seemed to crackle. Cairn could feel the hairs on his arms and the back of his neck standing on end. It was a dry, prickly heat, exactly like the feeling of the air blowing out of a newly opened desert tomb, the breath of a place that had been sealed away from the world for centuries. And with this feeling of energy came the undeniable sensation of being watched. It was more than just the trick of the flickering shadows and the painted eyes on the walls. It was a feeling of a distinct, intelligent, and unseen presence in the room with him. He was an intruder. He had stumbled into a sacred space, a place where a powerful and paranormal event was either in progress or had just concluded. The air was thick with the residue of a powerful will. He felt as if he were standing on a stage, moments after the main actor had departed, the power of their performance still hanging in the air. He was not alone in this room. The god or the demon or whatever it was that Ferrara had been trying to contact felt very, very close. He stood there for what seemed like an eternity, a man of science and reason completely adrift in a sea of supernatural sensations. The sight of the blasphemous frescoes, the sound of the hypnotic, ghostly chanting, the smell of the intoxicating, foul incense, and the feeling of the charged, watchful atmosphere. It was a coordinated, multisensory assault designed to overwhelm and break the human mind. This was the chamber of rituals. This was the heart of Antony Ferrara's madness. And as Cairn took his first, hesitant step into the room, moving from the threshold into the sanctum itself, he knew he was crossing a line. He was leaving his own world behind and stepping fully into the world of the cursed relic, into the world of the Witch Queen. And he had no idea if he would ever be able to find his way back. For a long moment, Robert Cairn remained rooted to the spot just inside the doorway, a man frozen on the shore of a deeply alien sea. The sheer, overwhelming sensory input of the room was a physical barrier, a wall of heat and sound and smoke that seemed to resist his entry. His scientific mind, his entire worldview, was reeling, struggling to find a logical framework for what he was seeing. This was not the study of a scholar. This was the den of a madman, a brilliant, methodical, and profoundly dangerous madman. But where was he? Where was Antony? The question finally broke through the paralysis. Concern for his friend, the very reason he had breached this forbidden chamber, surged past his fear and propelled him forward. He began a slow, cautious search through the chaos. It was like navigating the aftermath of a whirlwind. The familiar, ordered world of Ferrara's study had been completely upended. Books, priceless first editions and scholarly texts, were pulled from the shelves and lay open on the floor, their pages splayed and covered in the fine yellow sand. It was a sacrilege, a profound disrespect for the very knowledge they contained, as if Ferrara had deemed them all obsolete, irrelevant in the face of the new, darker knowledge he was pursuing. Ancient manuscripts, delicate papyrus scrolls that should have been kept in climate-controlled cases, were unrolled across chairs and tables, their edges curling and growing brittle in the dry heat from the brazier. Cairn had to step carefully to avoid treading on them, his heart aching at the sight of such casual destruction of historical treasures. And everywhere there were notes, scraps of paper, the backs of envelopes, even the margins of the open books, were covered in Ferrara's frantic, spidery handwriting. But it was not the neat, academic script Cairn was used to. This was the writing of a man possessed, full of jagged, angry-looking symbols, strange alchemical equations, and lines of hieroglyphs drawn with a feverish, almost violent, energy. The room was also littered with the strange paraphernalia of an alchemist's laboratory. Beakers and retorts of hand-blown glass sat on small tables, containing strange, colored liquids that seemed to shimmer in the flickering firelight. Mortars and pestles, stained with the residue of the exotic herbs that now smoldered in the brazier, lay discarded on the floor. There were strange charts of the heavens, not of the known constellations, but of ancient Egyptian celestial maps, aligning the stars with the fates of forgotten gods and dead pharaohs. It was a bizarre and unsettling fusion of science, history, and pure, unadulterated occultism. Cairn felt like an archaeologist who had stumbled not upon the tomb of a king, but upon the workshop of a court magician, a place where the lines between the natural and the supernatural were not just blurred, but had been willfully and systematically erased. He called out his friend's name again. "Antony, for God's sake, where are you?" His voice was swallowed by the thick, smoky air and the incessant, hypnotic drone of the chanting from the phonograph. There was no answer. He checked behind the large, leather armchair, looked under the tables. He even peered into the deep, dark shadows behind the displaced bookshelves. The room was empty. Ferrara was gone. A new, cold fear began to seep into Cairn's heart, a fear that was even deeper than the dread the room itself inspired. What if Ferrara's ritual, whatever it was, had succeeded? What if he had managed to open a doorway to some other terrible place and had been dragged through it? Or worse, what if the ritual had gone wrong, and his friend had been consumed, incinerated by a power he could not control, leaving nothing behind but this strange, charged atmosphere and the evidence of his own hubris. Cairn fought against these fantastical thoughts, his rational mind trying to assert itself. There had to be a logical explanation. Ferrara had simply stepped out. He was somewhere else in the house. He would return. But the feeling of wrongness in the room was too strong. It felt like a place of finality. It was then, as his eyes swept across the chaotic mess of the room one more time, that his gaze was drawn to a single point of order in the midst of the chaos. In the space directly in front of the pulsing, smoking brazier, there was a small, ornate pedestal, about waist-high, carved from a dark, almost black wood. Unlike every other surface in the room, this pedestal was immaculate. It was free of sand, of dust, of any of the clutter that littered the rest of the study. It had been draped with a small, square piece of rich, black velvet, which seemed to absorb the flickering light, making the space around it seem even darker. This one spot, this small island of deliberate, careful presentation, was clearly a place of immense importance. It was an altar, and whatever was being worshipped, whatever was the focal point of this entire mad ritual, would be on it. He approached it with a sense of both dread and an almost magnetic fascination. This was the heart of the mystery. The answer to his friend's madness lay here. As he drew closer, he could feel the heat from the brazier on his face, and the charged, static energy in the air was so strong here that it made his skin tingle. He stood before the pedestal and looked down. The cursed relic was revealed. Lying on the center of the black velvet cloth was an amulet. It was unlike any piece of Egyptian jewelry Cairn had ever seen or read about. The design was a perfect seven-pointed star, about the size of his palm. The material was not gold or silver or any metal he could recognize. It was a milky white, almost translucent material, smooth and cool-looking, like polished ivory or, he thought with a shudder, human bone. And at the very center of the star, where the 7 points met, was a single, magnificent gemstone. It was an opal, but an opal of a kind he had never seen before. It was enormous, and instead of the usual play of soft, pastel colors, this stone seemed to contain a living fire. A deep, burning, orange-red flame seemed to flicker in its depths, shifting and dancing as the light from the brazier played across its surface. The amulet was a thing of strange and terrible beauty. It was both exquisite and deeply unsettling. It did not feel like a piece of jewelry. It felt like a living thing, its fiery opal heart pulsing with a faint, inner light that seemed to beat in time with the hypnotic chanting from the phonograph. It was the source of the power in the room. He knew it instinctively. All the energy, all the heat, all the smoke, all the madness, it was all focused on this one singular object. This was the treasure Ferrara had been seeking. This was the key that unlocked the forbidden knowledge. This was the cursed relic. He stared at it, mesmerized. The world outside the small circle of light around the pedestal seemed to fade away. There was only him, the pulsing fire, the droning chant, and this beautiful, terrible object. It seemed to be calling to him, its fiery heart a silent, hypnotic song that drew him in, quieting the rational, fearful parts of his mind. It was in this mesmerized state that the fire in the brazier suddenly flared up. A pocket of resin or herbs must have caught light, for a tall, brilliant flame shot upwards for a moment, illuminating the entire room in a flash of bright, white light. The sudden glare made him flinch, but in that split second of intense illumination, he saw a new detail on the amulet, something that had been invisible in the dim, red glow. The surface of the white, star-shaped amulet was not smooth. It was covered, from point to point, with a series of tiny, almost microscopic, engraved lines. They were hieroglyphs, but they were of an ancient, primordial form, more like spidery, magical sigils than the formal characters of the pharaohs. They were so fine, so delicate, that it seemed impossible they could have been carved by a human hand. And in that brief, brilliant flash of white light from the brazier, the hieroglyphs did something impossible. They seemed to react to the light. For a single, breathtaking instant they glowed. A faint, but distinct, blue light shone from within the engraved lines. A cold, electric fire that traced the pattern of the ancient, sorcerous writing. The flame in the brazier died down as quickly as it had flared, plunging the room back into its sullen, red gloom. The blue glow in the hieroglyphs vanished. But the image was burned into Cairn's mind. The amulet was not just a passive object. It was reactive. It was a conduit for power. The ancient manuscripts on the wall, the strange chemicals, the incantations from the phonograph, they weren't just for show. They were the fuel. And this amulet was the engine. It was a piece of ancient, supernatural technology. And Ferrara had somehow, terrifyingly, managed to turn it on. The discovery sent a new, colder wave of fear through him. A fear that cut through the hypnotic haze that had settled on his mind. This was real. The magic was real, and the power it contained was now active, humming silently in the center of this room. He had found the source of the paranormal events, the heart of the historical mystery, and it was more beautiful and more terrifying than he could ever have imagined. He had found the amulet of the Witch Queen. The fleeting, blue glow of the hieroglyphs was like a flash of lightning that illuminated the true, terrifying landscape of the situation for Robert Cairn. The last vestiges of his scientific skepticism were incinerated in that moment. He was no longer a doctor trying to diagnose a friend's madness. He was a man standing before a live, humming, and unbelievably ancient source of supernatural power. The amulet on the velvet cloth was not just a historical artifact. It was a loaded weapon, and the entire room was a testament to the dangerous lengths his friend had gone to in order to find its trigger. He should have turned and fled. Every rational instinct, every fiber of his being that was still connected to the sane, logical world he had left behind, screamed at him to run, to get out of this hot, smoky, poison-scented room, to leave the chanting and the shadows and this beautiful, terrible object behind. He should have run out into the foggy London street and never looked back. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the sane thing to do. But he found that he could not move. He was rooted to the spot, his gaze locked on the amulet. A powerful and deeply unnatural struggle was taking place within him. It was a war between his intellect and a new primal urge he had never felt before. His mind, the mind of a physician, catalogued the dangers. The object could be radioactive, coated in some subtle ancient poison, or worse, it could be the focal point of a psychic contagion, a thing that could infect and destroy the mind of anyone who touched it. He knew, with an absolute certainty that was as profound as any scientific fact, that touching the amulet was a monumentally foolish and dangerous act. And yet, he felt an irresistible urge to do just that. It was a compulsion, a magnetic pull that was so strong it felt like a physical force. It was as if the amulet itself had a will, and it was exerting that will directly upon him. The fiery opal at its center seemed to pulse with a silent, hypnotic rhythm. A siren song that bypassed his ears and resonated directly with some ancient, forgotten part of his soul. Promised knowledge. Promised power. It promised a glimpse into the mysteries that his friend Anthony had so clearly been willing to sacrifice everything for. The urge to pick it up, to feel its weight in his hand, to know its secrets, became an overwhelming, all-consuming need. It was a hunger, a thirst, and it was a thirst that was rapidly becoming more powerful than his own instinct for self-preservation. He was aware, on some detached level, that this was not his own desire. He was being manipulated. The atmosphere of the room, the hypnotic chant, the disorienting smoke, the oppressive heat, it was all designed to break down a person's defenses, to make them susceptible to the amulet's silent persuasion. He was a fly that had wandered into a spider's web, and the spider was now gently tugging on the silk, drawing him inexorably towards the center. He fought against it. He clenched his fists at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. He tried to think of his life outside this room, of his patience, of the familiar, comforting logic of his work. He tried to force his legs to turn, to take a step back. But his body would not obey. He was a spectator in his own drama, watching in horror as his own hand began to rise, slowly, hesitantly, as if of its own accord. The hand moved through the thick, hazy air, a pale shape in the crimson gloom. He watched it as if it belonged to someone else. It reached out over the black velvet of the pedestal. It hovered there for a heart-stopping second, trembling slightly, a final moment of rebellion before the surrender. And then it descended. His fingers made contact with the amulet. The moment his skin touched the milky white surface of the relic, two things happened simultaneously, and with a shocking, instantaneous violence. The first was the sensation of touch. The amulet was not warm, as he had somehow expected it to be, lying so close to the heat of the brazier. It was cold, impossibly, unnaturally, shockingly cold. It was not the simple coolness of stone or ivory. It was a deep, penetrating, and absolute cold. A cold that felt like it was actively leaching the heat from his body. It was the cold of a glacier, the cold of the void between stars, the cold of a corpse that had been dead for 1,000 years. The cold shot up his arm like a jolt of icy electricity, a supernatural shock that made his heart leap in his chest and his breath catch in his throat. The second thing that happened, in the very same instant that his fingers touched the cold surface of the star, was that the sound in the room stopped. The monotonous, hypnotic chanting from the phonograph, which had been the constant, droning soundtrack to the entire experience, cut off abruptly. It did not fade out. It stopped mid-syllable, as if a switch had been flipped. And the sudden, ringing silence that crashed down in its place was more profound and more shocking than any noise. It was a vacuum, a total and complete absence of sound that made his ears ring. The world seemed to hold its breath. The connection had been made. The circuit was complete. He stood there, frozen, his fingers still resting on the impossibly cold amulet, his mind reeling from the sudden sensory shock. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound he could hear was the frantic, panicked hammering of his own heart. The fire in the brazier still pulsed, casting its dancing, demonic shadows. The thick, sweet smoke still swirled around him. But the energy in the room had changed. It was no longer a diffuse, ambient power. It was now focused. It was focused on him. And in the heart of that new, terrible, ringing silence, a new sound was born. It was not a sound in the room. He did not hear it with his ears. It was a sound that manifested directly inside his mind. It was a whisper. It was a whisper so faint, so intimate, that it felt as if someone were standing directly behind him, their lips just inches from his ear. But the voice was not coming from behind him. It was coming from within him. It was a dry, sibilant, and ancient sound. It was the sound of sand being stirred by a dry wind. It was the sound of papyrus crumbling to dust. It was the sound of a voice that had not passed through a living throat for countless centuries. And it was, unmistakably, the voice of a woman. The whisper began, a soft, rustling sound in the quiet chambers of his mind. And it began to speak. It spoke in a language he had never heard before, a language that was not of his time, or of any time he had ever studied. It was a language of guttural clicks and soft, hissing consonants, a language that felt older than the pyramids, older than civilization itself. It was the language of the Witch Queen. Though he could not understand the literal meaning of the words being whispered in his head, he understood their intent perfectly. The meaning was conveyed not through vocabulary, but through pure, undiluted emotion. The voice was filled with an arrogance and a power so immense it was terrifying. It was the voice of a queen, a goddess, a being who had never known what it was to be questioned or defied. And beneath the arrogance, there was a rage, a cold, ancient, and deeply patient rage. The rage of a monarch whose tomb had been violated, whose eternal rest had been disturbed, whose most sacred possession was now being touched by a crude, unworthy mortal hand. But the most terrifying emotion of all that was carried on the waves of that silent mental whisper was a feeling of possessiveness. The moment he had touched the amulet, a connection had been forged. Claim had been made. The whisper was not just a curse or a warning. It was a statement of ownership. The voice was saying, "You have touched me. You have woken me. And now you are mine." The chilling encounter was complete. He was no longer just an observer of the supernatural. He was in direct telepathic communication with it. The historical mystery of the Witch Queen was no longer a subject for academic study. She was here, a living, or rather undead, consciousness, and she was speaking inside his head. The cursed relic was not just a magical object. It was a vessel, a container for the soul, or at least a powerful, sentient echo of its original, malevolent owner. The psychic pressure of the voice was immense. It felt as if a great weight were pressing down on his own consciousness, trying to crush it, to extinguish it, to make room for the ancient, powerful will that was now invading his mind. He felt his own thoughts, his own identity, his very sense of self, begin to dissolve at the edges, like a photograph fading in the sun. He was being overwritten. The amulet was a key, and he had just used it to unlock a door in his own mind, a door through which something terrible and ancient was now pouring. With a final, desperate surge of his own will, he fought back. He broke the connection. He snatched his hand back from the amulet as if its icy surface had suddenly become white-hot. He stumbled backwards, tripping over a discarded book, and fell to the sandy floor. The moment he broke physical contact, the whisper in his head vanished. The psychic pressure lifted. The ringing silence returned. He was alone in his own mind once more. He scrambled backwards on the floor, away from the pedestal, his eyes still fixed on the terrible, beautiful object that now sat there, silent and innocent once more, its fiery opal heart pulsing gently in the gloom. He lay there, panting, his body trembling, drenched in a cold sweat. He had touched the heart of the mystery. He had heard the voice of the Witch Queen, and he knew, with a certainty that would haunt him for the rest of his life, that the whisper was not an end. It was a beginning. A terrible, dark, and intimate relationship had just been forged. He had been marked. Robert Cairn lay sprawled on the sandy floor of the ritual chamber, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. The silence in the room was a heavy, suffocating blanket, but it was nothing compared to the screaming silence that now raged inside his own mind. The ghostly, sibilant whisper was gone, but its echo remained, a psychic residue of ancient rage and possessive power that seemed to have stained his very thoughts. He had touched the forbidden. He had listened to the voice of the abyss, and the experience had fundamentally and irrevocably broken his world. He pushed himself up into a sitting position, his body trembling, his mind a chaotic whirlwind of terror and revelation. He looked around the strange, smoky room, the flickering brazier, the leering faces of the gods on the walls, the scattered, esoteric clutter, and he finally, truly, understood. The madness of his friend, Antony Ferrara, was not a simple descent into delusion. It was a journey with a very real and very terrible destination. And this amulet was the final stop. The source of Ferrara's power was now terrifyingly clear. Karen had heard rumors, of course, whispers in the academic community of Ferrara's increasingly strange experiments, of his uncanny ability to decipher texts that had baffled scholars for decades, of his almost supernatural insights into the minds of the ancient Egyptians. Karen had dismissed it all as the byproduct of his friend's obsessive genius. But now he knew the truth. It wasn't genius. It was a tool. Ferrara had not been deciphering the ancient magic. He had been using it. The amulet was the source. It was the otherworldly force that had been guiding his hand, whispering its ancient secrets into his ear, granting him the power he so desperately craved. This was no mere cursed relic that brought bad luck to its owner. This was an artifact of immense and active power, a direct conduit to the historical mysteries that Ferrara had been so obsessed with. It was a key that could unlock the minds of the dead. But what a terrible price it extracted for that knowledge. The price was a slow, creeping invasion of the self, a surrendering of one's own will to the ancient, powerful consciousness that resided within the amulet. Ferrara hadn't just found a source of power. He had entered into a partnership, a dark and terrible symbiosis with the long-dead queen. And looking at the state of this room, at the evidence of a mind that had abandoned all reason in pursuit of a single, all-consuming goal, Karen feared it was a partnership that had completely consumed his friend. This realization led him to the second, and more profound, level of the mystery. The nature of the entity within the amulet. The dry, female whisper, so full of arrogance and rage, was not just a simple curse, a magical booby trap left to ward off tomb robbers. It had felt like a personality, consciousness, a living or at least sentient will. The chilling encounter had not been with a magical force, but with a person. The amulet, he now believed, was more than just a magical object. It was a vessel, a kind of psychic prison or phylactery, designed to hold the consciousness, or at least a powerful and perfect echo, of the ancient witch queen herself. He thought of the Egyptian obsession with the afterlife, their complex beliefs about the different parts of the soul, the Ka, the Ba, the Ak. Had this queen, this powerful sorceress, found a way to cheat death not by preserving her body, but by binding the most essential parts of her soul, her will and her memory, to this physical object? It was a theory that was both fantastical and, in the context of this room, terrifyingly plausible. If that were true, then touching the amulet was not just about activating a magical spell. It was about making contact with a mind that had been trapped in silent, furious solitude for 3,000 years. It was like knocking on the door of a tomb and having the occupant answer. The whisper he had heard was the queen's own voice, a direct telepathic link across the millennia. And her rage was not just the anger of a disturbed spirit. It was the fury of a captured goddess, a being of immense power who was now bound to this small, star-shaped object, able to influence the world only through those foolish or desperate enough to seek her power. This made the amulet a dangerous tool of unimaginable proportions. It was a direct line to a being with knowledge and power beyond mortal comprehension. But to use that tool to ask for that knowledge, one had to invite that being into one's own mind. And Karen had felt the pressure of that will. It was a will that did not tolerate equals. It did not form partnerships. It dominated, consumed. To use the amulet was to slowly be erased, your own personality overwritten by the ancient, powerful, and utterly ruthless consciousness of the Witch Queen. Ferrara, in his hunger for forgotten knowledge, had made a terrible bargain. He had offered up his own soul as food for the ghost in the machine. And this led Karen to the final, and most pressing, unsolved mystery. The core question that now pulsed in the air of the room, as potent and as terrifying as the amulet itself. What unholy power does this amulet truly hold? What, specifically, does it grant its wielder, and what does it demand in ultimate payment? The evidence of its power was all around him. The deep, esoteric knowledge that had made Ferrara a legend. The ability to create this ritual chamber, to transform a London study into a pocket of ancient Egypt. The sheer, raw energy that still crackled in the air. The amulet was a key to immense power. But what kind? Did it grant the user the ability to command spirits? To see into the past or the future? To cast spells, to curse enemies, to defy death itself? The possibilities were as limitless as they were terrifying. The ancient manuscripts scattered on the floor probably held the answers, the specific rituals and incantations needed to channel the queen's power into specific effects. But whatever the gift, the price was clear. The whisper had made that much obvious. The price was servitude. The price was one's own mind. The witch queen would grant her power to a wielder, but only because that wielder would become her hands, her eyes, her voice in the world of the living. She was a parasite and she needed a host. The chilling encounter was not a one-time event. It was the beginning of an infection. Cairn felt it still, a cold spot in the back of his mind where the whisper had been, a psychic wound that he feared might never truly heal. He struggled to his feet, his body aching, his mind feeling bruised and fragile. He had to get out of this room. He had to get away from the amulet. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving the small, white star on the pedestal. It sat there, looking beautiful and serene, its fiery opal heart pulsing gently, a silent, waiting predator. It had failed to capture him, but it seemed utterly unconcerned. It was patient. It had been waiting for 3,000 years. Could wait a little longer. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back one last time. The question that had been swirling in his mind now presented itself to him as a direct, personal challenge. The question he had unknowingly been asking himself since the moment he touched the amulet. It was the question that now defines this entire mystery. What would he do? What would anyone do, having felt its power, having glimpsed the possibilities it offered? He now knew what it was. He knew where the danger lay. He could perhaps find a way to destroy it, to smash the star of bone, to crush the fiery opal, and perhaps, in doing so, to finally release the furious, tormented soul of the witch queen into the oblivion she had tried so hard to cheat. It would be the safe thing to do, the sane thing to do. It would be an act of mercy, both for the world and for the spirit trapped within. But the thought was a difficult one. To destroy such an object, an artifact of such immense power and historical significance, it felt like a crime. A form of vandalism on a cosmic scale. And the whisper, though terrifying, had also been intoxicating. The sheer, raw power he had felt in that brief mental contact was a drug more potent than any opium. The allure of it, the temptation to understand it, to perhaps even control it, was a subtle poison that was already beginning to work its way into his thoughts. He could try to use it. He was a man of science, of strong will. Perhaps he could be more careful than Ferrara. Perhaps he could dip into its well of knowledge without falling in. He could learn its secrets, use its power for good, for the advancement of human knowledge. He could become the greatest historian, the greatest doctor the world had ever known. He could solve the mysteries of the past, perhaps even the mystery of death itself. All he had to do was reach out and take it. All he had to do was be willing to listen to the whispers again. He stood there, caught on the horns of an impossible dilemma. To destroy it or to use it. To be a hero or to be a god. To save his soul or to risk it for ultimate power. With a choked cry, he turned and fled. He ran from the room, slamming the door shut behind him, as if the simple wooden barrier could contain the ancient, cosmic horror within. He ran down the stairs, out of the silent, waiting house, and into the cold, clean air of the London dawn. But he knew as he ran that he could not escape it. The question would follow him forever. The feeling of the cold amulet, the sound of the sibilant whisper, the allure of its unanswered power, would now be a part of him for the rest of his life. He had stumbled upon the greatest unsolved mystery of his time, and it had left him with the most terrible question of all. Cairn drops the amulet, the ghostly whisper fading but the feeling of its cold, ancient rage remaining. He has found the source of his friend's madness, a cursed relic that holds the very soul of a long-dead queen. What unholy power does this amulet truly hold? And after feeling its curse, what would you do? Destroy it or dare to use it? Let me know your choice. Thanks for braving the shadows with Gravevale Echoes. What creepy secret haunts you? Subscribe, share your fears, and return for more gothic chills from the unseen world.